Hey everyone, thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum. More specifically, we're going to talk about the ETH Bitcoin valuation. Of course, we'll also talk about ETH USD as well. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. ETH Bitcoin has finally taken the plunge to 0.03. Technically speaking, and as we said before, being technically correct is the best way to be correct. It has actually gone below 0.03 and it has gone to 0.02996. Now, one of the things I've mentioned before, and I said this back in 2022, that the target range in my mind for ETH Bitcoin was between 0.03 to 0.04. Okay. Now, the reason I said that was, frankly, that's what normally happens, right? If you look at the pattern that ETH Bitcoin has gone on in the past, it does this thing where it puts in a high, it then sets an intermediate low, it then puts in a lower high, consolidates above that level for a while, and then drops and forms the bottom. Same idea over here. A high, a range low, a lower high, consolidates for a while, and then finds the bottom right there. And so the argument, right? The argument back over here at the merge was, guys, what if it's just doing the same thing, right? Where it sets a high, sets a range low, a lower high, consolidates for a while, and then eventually drops and theoretically sets a bottom. Now, I have said that ETH Bitcoin could bottom as late as January of 2025. Of course, it does raise the question, will it continue to go down? But if you're curious where that range came from, 0.03 to 0.04, right? Did I just draw it out of thin air? The general idea was that it needed to go at least below the range low, right? At least go below the range low, which was at 0.049, and 0.04 was a realistic outcome because if you look at what happened last cycle, you'll see that when ETH dropped, right, when it had this drop right here, dropped about 28% or so. So if you go from like 0.049 and you go down, 20%, that gets you to 0.04. And if you look at what happened in 2016, below the range low, ETH Bitcoin dropped closer to like 50%. Now, if you go from there down to 0.03, that drop, right, that drop actually is about 40%, right? So this was a 30% drop. This was a 50% drop. So far, this has been a 40% drop. But the reason why I came up with 0.03 was because I thought that back in 2019, ETH Bitcoin had this double bottom structure that was not part of a bubble. It then built off of that structure, right? Putting in higher lows. And then here is where the bubble began, right? Because from that point, there was no market structure anymore. It was just straight up. And so 0.03 came from the idea that ETH Bitcoin could eventually go back down to where the bubble began, right? That was the argument. Where the bubble began was where ETH Bitcoin could go to. And you can kind of see, certain things that are a little similar, right? If you argue that last cycle ETH Bitcoin came back down here, and you can argue that that was more or less right there. That was where the bubble began, right? That's where it dropped down to. So that was where 0.03 came from. Technically, that wick back then was all the way down at 0.02934. It's actually lower than we've currently gone, but that's where 0.03 came from. Bitcoin dominance was the same idea. 60%, later on was confirmation bias when looking at the fib retracement, right? If you look at the fib retracement from last cycle, you'll notice that Bitcoin dominance rallied to 0.618, and you'll notice here too, Bitcoin dominance has gone up to the 0.618. But that was confirmation bias for me. The reason why I picked 60% all those years ago wasn't because of any fib retracement stuff. It was actually because I thought that the altcoin market entered into its bubble against Bitcoin right there, where it broke down. And that's where I thought it would return to. And that's why I said I thought it would go back to 60%. Okay. So when you think about ETH Bitcoin, that was generally the argument. The other thing to remember with ETH Bitcoin is it kind of operates in the reverse of Bitcoin dominance. So, for instance, Bitcoin dominance, a lot of people were very bearish on Bitcoin dominance over the last few years. But if you look at it objectively, these were all higher lows. I mean, this was a low and then a higher low. But then you could also argue that it might be setting lower highs as well. So, what it's doing potentially is oscillating and converging to where the fair value of Bitcoin dominance is. Now, a maxi would say the fair value is 100%. And to be completely honest, with all the meme coins launching recently, sometimes I feel like the industry deserves 100% Bitcoin dominance just so we can learn our lessons and focus on what really matters. But we're probably not going to see 100% Bitcoin dominance, right? There's a good chance it just kind of oscillates around. And you could argue that ETH dominance is doing the exact opposite. A long time ago, I said ETH dominance would likely return to about, 10 to 11%. And the reason I said 10 to 11 or 9 to 10, 9 to 10, 9 to 11, I don't remember exactly what I said, was because basically if you put in the lower high structure and the higher low structure, it gets you to around 10%. Okay. Now you could redraw this in any number of ways to make it look like we've already tagged it. And it's possible that we have, right? I mean, you could draw it like this and say, maybe that's close enough, to a bottom for ETH dominance, but that's my general thought on how I was sort of trying to figure out what could cause ETH Bitcoin to drop that far, and we can make up a reason. You know, I think the hard part for a lot of people this cycle is sort of the constant need to call for alt season. When last cycle, we know that alt season didn't truly begin, where the altcoin market collectively durably outperformed Bitcoin for more than just today. We know it didn't really start, it didn't have a chance until the Fed began quantitative easing, right? And so if you overlay the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve with ETH Bitcoin, you'll notice that ETH Bitcoin bottomed precisely when quantitative tightening ended. And this cycle, it just hasn't ended yet. Now, maybe it'll end soon, but it hasn't ended yet. And that's something you have to keep in mind. Now, for me, ETH Bitcoin is a fairly attractive level. I mean, 0.032, 0.03, it's fairly attractive. It doesn't mean it can't go lower, but it seems like a relatively low valuation in my mind. I'm certainly more interested in this than I ever was in 0.08 and 0.07 and 0.06 and 0.05. I didn't even start to consider ETH until it went below 0.04, right? So for me, it's an evaluation that seems pretty low, right? But I mean, the sort of the Bitcoin maxi and all of us, right? After you've gone through enough cycles, you'd be lying to yourself to say that there's not a part of you that probably is sort of a maxi at heart. In some ways, especially when you see all these meme coins launching constantly, and you're just like, when will people learn that this should not be the future of the industry? But yet, that's what the industry seems to be focused on, and people just can't help themselves, And there's no point in trying to stop it. It's gonna do what it's gonna do, but it's kind of sad to see that that's the way the industry has gone. To just speak frankly, and that's just where we are. That's just where the industry is, and I do think that we're kind of setting up for a reckoning at some point. Normally, bear markets begin sometime in the post-halving year, but you can kind of see it all coming together, right? You have an uninverted yield curve, you have hires, low, you have quits low, unemployment rate slowly going up. It's all setting up for some type of big event at some point. Who knows when that will be, but it seems like it's setting up. I would argue, though, that while ETH Bitcoin looks relatively low, right? We know that QE hasn't begun yet, and so there's got to be at least part of you that has to remember that until QE begins, there's always a chance it could go lower, regardless of whether, it goes below, well below what I thought was the lower part of the range of 0.03. Okay, it's always possible that it goes lower if quantitative tightening continues. Just the case. The thing that I think all Bitcoin pairs have to reconcile is that normally they're oscillators at best. And so, if ETH Bitcoin doesn't bounce soon, then how long can alt Bitcoin pairs justify being up here when, history shows they eventually go to the range lows? So ETH Bitcoin, again, seems relatively low. ETH USD, honestly, I have an interesting relationship with. And I think ETH analysis for me is really difficult because like ETH Bitcoin has always operated how I thought that it would this cycle. I always thought it would just bleed until QB began, and I thought it could bleed until January of 2025. I said that many, many times. So it's kind of always done what I thought it was going to do. And I think it took a lot of other people a long time to recognize that. You know, every single pump, I was sort of called out and I was trolled, and you can kind of see that none of that mattered. But here's the thing: we all get things wrong, right? I was right. I was right about this. I was wrong about the path of ETH USD. And that is what has really tripped me up this cycle. Now, my coping mechanism for that was that, well, it was just Bitcoin heavy, right? So, yeah, ETH USD outperformed my expectations by a lot, but it doesn't really matter, right? My portfolio was just Bitcoin heavy. So, what do I care if ETH went up, from here to here, right? What do I care if it went up 355% during a time when Bitcoin, right? And we'll talk about this later, when Bitcoin went up 581%, right? I don't care so much about that. It made sense to be in Bitcoin and not be in Ethereum. And if you have a hard time understanding that, that's your problem, not mine, right? I mean, it's just opportunity cost. Bitcoin is, in fact, a lower risk asset than Ethereum. The last 2 to 3 years should have taught you that. And if you haven't learned that lesson by now, then I don't know what to tell you. It doesn't mean that Ethereum can't ever outperform Bitcoin. It probably will, but Bitcoin is a lower risk asset. It does better during more difficult times. Okay. But while I was right about ETH Bitcoin, ETH USD, honestly, wasn't really that great about. I mean, last cycle, I feel like I nailed ETH USD. Honestly, I feel like I did it. It seems so obvious to me because it had this higher low structure. It had the higher low structure during quantitative tightening, right? And you can overlay the balance sheet of the Fed, right? Had the higher low structure. It broke down just before QE began. And so this was just a macro higher low. And I was ecstatic. I'm like, guys, it's a macro higher low. ETH is going to go up. Now it did. Then we got the pandemic just to scare everyone once more. And then it went up a lot. So this cycle, I was right about ETH Bitcoin, but I was wrong about ETH USD. And I look at it and I was like, well, it'll do the same thing as it did last cycle, right? It's forming this higher low structure. It'll eventually break down, put in a higher low, and it'll go up from there. That's what I thought, right? If you had asked me in 2022, 2023, 2024 even, I would have said that is the most likely outcome. It'll break the higher low structure, go down, form a macro higher low, and then go up from there. It's the same structure that we've seen with so many other assets. One of my favorite assets to cover in the equity side of the market is Tesla. And that's what Tesla did, right? It had a similar higher low structure. It broke it. It formed a macro higher low. I became very bullish on it. I've been bull posting about Tesla for months. And then it went on to put in new highs, right? But after it, around this time, it was struggling to do that. It broke structure, macro higher low, and then up. So my argument was that ETH USD will do the same thing, right? It'll do the same thing. And so what essentially happened is I was looking at 2016 and saying, well, look at this, guys. This is what I was saying like a few months ago. I was like, well, look, in 2016, ETH USD had a low in April, had a low in August, and a low in December. What if we do the same thing, right? If we do the same thing, then the lower high structure or the higher low structure will break. And that will give you the macro higher low to look for. And then you should bounce to new all-time highs. So we got it in April. We got the low in April. We got the low in August. And I was there, right? I was like, all right, we're going to get the low in December. And then it should be all systems go. And then ETH didn't break down, right? It didn't break below the higher low structure. But then there's part of me that thinks, in the pursuit of truth and like what is going to happen, like what does make the most amount of sense, the thing I have to remind myself of is that maybe the higher low structure never broke because there was never a reason for QE to return. Last cycle, the higher low structure did not break until just before QE began. You could argue that it was because there was weakness in the markets that ETH USD did break down, and because liquidity was an issue, QE resumed. So there's part of me that's like, well, maybe the reason that ETH has been so weak is because it's still in this phase of the cycle. The quantitative tightening phase of the cycle. The angle of attack during a parabolic rally type Ethereum is a lot greater than what you see during the quantitative tightening phase, right? If you're not going through quantitative tightening, right? If you're not going through this, then the angle of attack is a lot higher. I believe there's a tool on here that allows me to measure that. I mean, you have to remember it's going to be affected by whatever aspect ratio you're using. But here it is. If you look here at like the angle of attack, this is 83 degrees. Again, if you're trying to reproduce this on your own chart, you're going to get something different because the aspect ratio for you is going to be different depending on how you're zoomed in. This angle of attack was 82 degrees. The angle of attack over here, 63 degrees. But this one in 2019 was less than 60, right? It was 57%. This one here has been abysmal, right? It's been so low. Maybe the reason it hasn't been that great is because quantitative tightening never ended. So again, I can brag all I want about ETH Bitcoin. But if you're going to lift yourself up for what you get right, you might as well acknowledge where you went wrong. And for me, I sort of forced myself to see Ethereum through a different lens back over here in Q3, even though I wanted it to break down so badly. I was like, technically ETH Bitcoin is at 0.03, right? 0.035, whatever, right? It's not that bad of a valuation, whether I like it or not, right? It's not that bad. And so maybe actually Ethereum will just simply bounce from here if we get another rally by Bitcoin in Q4. And it did, and the only way you're going to get Ethereum to go down is if Bitcoin goes down at this point in any durable fashion, right? So then I'm trying to think like, well, why didn't, is this a pattern that is just not going to repeat itself, right? Because we're in the post-halving year, are we beyond the window where a lower low could happen? And there's a good chance it doesn't happen, right? If you look at Ethereum in the short term, it's still above the bull market support band, right? It's still above it. And as long as it's holding the 20-week SMA and or 21-week EMA, I think it makes sense to be open-minded that this could just simply hold as support. That's at least my thought process, right? As long as it's above the bull market support band. And even if you look at it through the lens of this, you can see that there was a drop in Q3 here, and then a drop in Q3 here, a move up, and then a consolidation phase, and then another move up in February. What if it's just doing that where it's going to move up again in February? Always a chance. In fact, if you look at Bitcoin on the weekly, it looks kind of similar as last year, right? A big move up. But does it see follow through this week? I don't know. One of the things that's interesting about ETH USD, though, if it breaks the bull market support band, right? No one knows if it's going to happen. So get your comments. No one knows, right? But let's just say a little birdie flew in and told you, hey, ETH isn't going to hold support, right? Then what? Then what is the most likely outcome? Then I think it goes back to the drawing board of, what if you just are getting another lower low, right? Just like you got in 2016, but it just took an extra month. One of the interesting things, or 2 months or 3 months, right? One of the interesting things is the last two, and we talked about this in one of the last videos on Ethereum. Does anyone know what I'm going to say? Pause the video. What am I going to mention next as it relates to these two wicks? We talked about it 2 months ago, a month ago, right? What caused those two wicks? No one knows. We can assign a narrative to anything. But what could we say caused it? If you look at the Bank of Japan, hopefully someone got it, right? Hopefully one of you guys knew what I was going to say, even if I'm completely blowing smoke here and it doesn't actually matter. Hopefully someone knew what I was going to say. Trying to get this to load. But if you look at Japanese interest rates, right? Japan interest rates. The last two wicks that ETH got down here were right after the Bank of Japan raised rates. They raised rates in March. ETH USD capitulated in early April. They raised rates in July. ETH USD capitulated in early August. The reason I'm bringing this up, the last time I mentioned this was, December before the Bank of Japan meeting. They did not raise rates in December. But they're meeting on the 23rd of January, I believe, and the market forecast has as a really, really high probability that they're going to raise rates. Now, if they raise rates, that could lead to the further unwind of the carry trade. If that happens, you might see this happen once again, right? Where it basically just takes out the structure and puts in another lower low. I'm not saying it has to be your base case, but it should be something that if it happens, it doesn't take you completely by surprise. Maybe the fact that I'm mentioning it is enough to keep it from happening, right? Obviously, I don't truly believe that, but I just want people to be aware, okay? Now, I want to mention there is one thing that I've seen this pattern before. I've looked at the S&P 500 a lot, and there's one area on the S&P where you'll find this exact same pattern, where you have a triple top. Now, if Ethereum can take out this high, this pattern is null and void. And it had a lower low structure. And when that last happened by the S&P 500, right? When that happened, it was actually in 1990. It was in 1990. And if we were to pull it up, you can see what I'm talking about. So we're going to go back to 1990. And you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, 1990 is interesting because it actually was a recession. But look at this. It's a similar pattern. It's a similar pattern. You have sort of a triple top. The third top actually took out the prior high. Now, is that true with Ethereum? If you look at it on a daily time frame, it looks a little more similar, right? Where the triple top was sort of a double top in and of itself. Right? Where it took out this prior high from over here. This high was at 4,093, but this high over here was below that, right? 4,090. So this was a double top higher high, just like the S&P was a double top higher high. Isn't that interesting? But the S&P eventually dropped into a lower low. And then it took off from there. Now, I'm mentioning that because if this were to happen, it would scare a lot of people, right? It would. But you should know ahead of time that if it does happen, it would be an insane accumulation phase. And the reason I say that is because going down there would be enough to finally take ETH to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, which is where it was going in 2016 which is where I thought it was going to go at the end of 2024, but it never went there. Now, the only way you're going to get that, the only way, is if Bitcoin gets a correction, right? If Bitcoin breaks up in February, like it did last February, right? If it gets this move here, where you see follow through, right? You have this weekly candle there, kind of like that one. If Bitcoin gets follow through and goes up again, then there's a good chance Ethereum's not going to, play that structure out. But if you were to look at the fib retracement tool, one of the things you may notice is that Bitcoin right now is struggling to get through the 1.618 fib, right? And if it can't get through it, you'll notice that when Bitcoin has previously struggled with a fib, it'll then go back down and retest the one below it. If Bitcoin cannot get through the 1.618 and drops back down here, then you could argue that it's essentially back testing the lower high structure from last year, right? If it were to do that. If Bitcoin were to get that drop, then it would be enough to make ETH put in that lower low right around the time that the Bank of Japan is raising rates, or not. It normally happens a couple weeks later, right? So that's the way that it could happen. Not that it has to. That's the way that it could happen. And I will remind you that, when the QQQ was launched, it did get a sizable correction. That sizable correction, it topped 54 weeks later, but the sizable correction by the QQQ did not begin until 55 weeks later. Now, what's interesting is if you look at Bitcoin, when the QQQ launched, back over here, right on this wick, we're about to enter week 54. Or we're in week 54 now. Next week will be week 55, which is when the QQQ got a correction. Now, it got that correction in March, which is a more frequent time to get that correction. But you also have to wonder about the idea of a left translated cycle versus a right translated cycle. Hopefully, we just get a right translated cycle where you get a Bitcoin peak in Q4 of the post-halving year, like prior ones. Right, like this one, Q4 2013, Q4 2017, Q4 2021. But as we pointed out before, if you look at the S&P, there are times where you get left translated cycles, even if it's not the most likely scenario. There are times, right? In the 1970s, during these periods of high inflation, you actually got left translated cycles, right? Here and here. This occurred in December of 68. This occurred in January of 73. The top occurred in December, and then it was a lower high in May, and then the market just bled on down. Same thing over here. You'd prefer a right translated peak where the peak occurs only 1 year before the low, not 2 years before the low. So I think the argument right now for ETH Bitcoin, in my mind, is that it is relatively low. I do think it likely will be higher in a year than it is today. Obviously, since QE has not begun yet, always a chance it could go lower. But I don't think it's that far away from whatever the bottom's going to be if it's not already in. The 0.03 level that I gave you guys as a potential target was because of that right there, because that's where I thought the bubble began. ETH Bitcoin analysis always made sense to me. Even if it didn't make sense to other people, it made sense to me. And I always wondered why other people had a hard time seeing it. But the trick is they could have said the same thing about ETH USD. So it's kind of like both sides were right and both sides were wrong, right? And that's why this market cycle has been so difficult. It's like technically ETH has gone up, but Bitcoin drastically outperformed it, right? So you're definitely better off with Bitcoin than Ethereum. When does it change? Does it change when QE begins? Does it never change? I do think it will eventually change, but it gets hard, when you see ETH Bitcoin drop like this. And the only thing I can think of is the only reason ETH Bitcoin hasn't truly found a major level to rally off of. One reason could be because ETH USD never went home. right? And if it had gone home, maybe Ethereum would be doing much better now. But because it never went home to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, ETH/USD has struggled so much. But here's the thing. In order for it to go home, you could argue that QE has to come back into the picture. Because the last cycle, when it went home, it was as QE was returning. That never happened this cycle. What if it still does happen? And, we all thought it was going to happen sooner, and it just happens in 2025, right? I don't know. I do think again that ETH Bitcoin is at a relatively attractive valuation. ETH USD has been sort of a pain in my side for so long, because it's like, if it did put in a macro higher low, like if it broke support, like that macro higher low, I feel like that would be enough to send it to new highs. But it never did that. And I think that's one of the reasons why it struggled so much this cycle, is because neither side really got what they want, right? The people that wanted to come down here never got it. The people that wanted it to come, go up to 10K also haven't seen it. Even though Bitcoin's already above 100K, ETH USD isn't even at a new all-time high yet, right? Which is just insane to think about. I think that's kind of the reason. I'm just trying to be honest. I'm not trying to pull a fast one on you. Just trying to show you what I got right, what I got wrong. How does it make sense? If you see a lower low by Ethereum, it's probably a great opportunity. If you don't, you could already argue that ETH Bitcoin is at a relatively attractive valuation regardless. If ETH USD drops and ETH Bitcoin gets, like, say, a wick or something, like it did previously in some of those drops, I think it would be a good opportunity. Like, here's a wick low in August. I think that'd be a good opportunity. But anyways, guys, those are my thoughts on ETH Bitcoin and ETH USD. Hopefully it's helpful to some of you guys, and we'll see what ETH Bitcoin has in store for us later on in 2025. Thank you guys for tuning in. And obviously, with a new administration coming in, things could change. Who knows? But we'll see. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on ITC Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.